So welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Corman and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. Thank you to all of you that have attended our past programs. We look forward to continuing to bring you a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, faculty, and staff experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. Before we start our program, I want to share some exciting news with you. We have recently launched UIC Connected, our online networking and mentoring platform. Please enjoy this quick video to hear more about UIC Connected. I hope that you enjoyed that quick video and that you're as excited about UIC Connected as we are. You can go to go.uic.edu/connected, and we'll go ahead and put that in the chat so you can join today. And with that, I'm excited to start our program this afternoon. Let me go ahead and stop share real fast. Okay. Today we are joined by Associate Professor Stewart Hicks from UIC's College of Architecture, Design, and the Arts. Professor Hicks will discuss his unique approach to investigating architecture in the context of graphic novels, Legos, and even perhaps we'll hear about George Costanza and how he plays into this. We are excited to hear about how buildings can live beyond their bricks and mortar. Thank you, Professor Hicks, for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you to begin the program.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really, really exciting. Thank you, everyone, for spending your lunch hour with me. I think I saw some people from Hawaii and Princeton and all over the country and the world, and that's truly amazing. Today, I want to talk a little bit about some stuff that I've been working on for the last few months. But first, a little bit about me. I teach design studios and lecture courses at the University of Illinois at Chicago at the School of Architecture. And I'm also an associate dean of facility-related things for the College of Architecture, Design, and the Arts. My design practice is called Design with Company, and we publish writings, design exhibitions, and we do a few small-scale constructions. And today, what I'd like to talk to you guys about is how architecture coexists with stories inside of media like books or film or even YouTube, and share some of the YouTube videos that I've made on the subject. Stories have always been a part of our design process, like in the first two Chicago architectural biennials, which included some of our research into some of the into design and stories in the form of some design displays. And the first one was a study on the Chicago Public Library, which is a building devoted to holding stories. And we dug through the archive of all the public opinions for the building that were collected as part of the original design competition. It was completely fascinating to hear what people had to say about it. And we picked out a few different threads of what people were saying and their interpretations of the different designs. And then we made a literal model of each one of their interpretations or suggestions. And then we created a kind of pile of all of these personal interpretations into a single collage. And this kind of delaminated a set of individual Chicagoans' thoughts about personal opinions about the building. And this is really related to the way that I see architecture. I see it as a kind of a sum total of people's interpretations surrounding a building. In the next iteration of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, we did what we thought was a kind of rebrand of the steel frame structure that holds up most of Chicago's early skyscrapers. And some people originally claimed that the structural steel frame of these buildings wasn't really architecture, that it was just a solution to a problem. And so we redrew the steel frames to look only at their geometry so that we could appreciate its beauty and the nuance in its geometry. And then seeing them in this way, we were able to read and understand the logic of their patterns with no other clues than how the steel is arranged. And then we even plucked a few interesting joints out of the context of the steel frames so that we could look at each one in isolation. And they started to look like bugs, or what we were calling specimens, right above us, right above me, to kind of study them and look at each of the little geometries that are kind of lurking inside of our buildings without us even really knowing it. Or when we edited a journal on the idea of character in architecture, we tried to unpack how stories influence architecture at multiple levels. And we looked at how architects think about occupants of buildings as fictional characters, or when buildings themselves are characters, or when architects fictionalize their own persona, like when the Chicago architect Stanley Tigerman wrote a review of his own exhibition that he did himself. So he wrote a review of his own exhibition, the review that he wished other people would have written, and he wrote it under the pseudonym Morris Lesser, which is a play on the saying that Mies van der Rohe used to have, that less is more, and he reversed that and called himself Morris Lesser. It's a very Stanley thing to do. The journal was dedicated to Stanley Tigerman, who passed away just before the journal's release, and the cover bears an incredible drawing by him. The drawing includes some of his building designs that are set inside of a fantastical world of his imagination. Sometimes this drawing goes on view at the Art Institute of Chicago. But a lot of this work is in service of trying to understand a phenomenon that I think is really exemplified by this building here. You've likely probably never noticed this building before. If you have, you're probably some diehard architecture or Chicago nerd. It sits at 500 West Superior here in Chicago. And admittedly, there's not much remarkable about this building at first glance. Likely everyone's probably pretty ambivalent to it, if not put off by the exaggeratedly large and massive columns at the corners of the building. It was designed by a pretty famous architect named Minoru Yamasaki, who is a very early Japanese-American architect, who is mostly known as the architect of the original World Trade Center Twin Towers. But I don't think that this fact alone makes the building all that interesting. Rather, the building was the brainchild of the Montgomery Ward CEO at the time, named Robert Elton Brooker. And the building's appearance actually comes from the idea that Brooker had about how offices should be. That he had this egalitarian idea that no executive should have a corner office because everyone just kind of fights over them. So they covered the corners of the building and made them the building's circulation. So basically the parts of the building that allow people to go up and down, rather than giving them over to people who just want them for status's sake. And so that's the reason for the building's massive corners. There was also a considerable amount of pressure for the company to move out of the neighborhood, which was in deep decline at the time. It was very near Cabrini Green. But Brooker insisted that they stay and invest in the neighborhood that they were a part of. So they built this building near their old headquarters and decided to root themselves into this particular neighborhood in the city. And when I first heard about this, I instantly gained a certain amount of appreciation for this building that I just never would have noticed or cared about before. And it's not the architecture that's any different. You know, it's the story and the reasoning behind it and the way that it was designed and the way that it was communicated to me that allowed me to have a certain amount of empathy and understanding and connection with the built environment that I'm a part of. And that idea really resonated with a lesson that I learned in architecture school when I was in graduate school. And the lesson comes by way of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And the story goes that after the French Revolution in 1789, Notre Dame was seized and made public, and all of the Catholic Church's property was removed from the building. And then after the Napoleonic Wars, Notre Dame was in such a state of disrepair that Paris officials considered demolishing it, which is completely inconceivable today. The building seems like such an important destination and icon for the city of Paris, but it's true that they were really planning to demolish the building. The author and the amateur architectural theorist named Victor Hugo thought it was too important of a piece of architecture to lose, so he set out to save it. And he thought to himself that people don't really understand this building, and that's why they don't really care right now. So Victor Hugo decided to write a novel during the era at the dawn of the popularity of the novel as a form of mass media. And with the rising literacy rates and the easily easy ability to mass produce books on the printing press, the novel quickly became the preferred medium of information exchange and entertainment at the time. And of course, The Hunchback of Notre Dame is a story where architecture figures pretty heavily into the story, not just as a setting for it, but also as a character. And in the book, there's a line where the archbishop points to the book and says, "This will kill that. The book will kill the edifice," or the edifice meaning the building. And at first glance, this sounds like a really, really strange thing to say. Books and buildings are not the same category of objects. But what he means is that architecture's most important role up to that point, he believed, even beyond providing shelter, was about turning culture's important stories into stone. And buildings like the Notre Dame Cathedral originally would have been read like you would have read a book. And all the ornament on the outside and all the sculpture that you're seeing behind me is a story that the average person would have been able to understand and to read. But then all of a sudden came along the printing press and the mass production of books and novels and increased literacy. And this meant that stories could be conveyed in other more portable ways, and that architecture was no longer really needed to do the same job anymore. And so in this way, the book does kill the building. A book is better at a kind of direct communication than a building would be. But ironically, Victor Hugo's book actually saved Notre Dame Cathedral because it really reignited the presence of this building inside of the collective imagination of the Parisians at the time. So it's the story and the media in combination with the building that allows the building to resonate with the public. And in my eyes, ever since this moment, there's a really important link between architecture and popular media to deliver the stories to the public. It's not on the building itself alone anymore, that it really requires this kind of back and forth and these different sort of institutions working together to really make a great public realm. And reflecting on it, I think that I became attuned to the importance of stories to our built environment growing up in and around Detroit in the 1980s, which looked a lot like this at the time. Very large, opulent houses in various states of disrepair that are all separated by vast empty lots. Of course, you know this era of Detroit as the era and location that spawned the original RoboCop. But to me, it seemed like there was two Detroits, because I heard of these stories about how vibrant the city was like only 20 to 30 years earlier. But the city that I knew and saw and only had access to physically looked like this. And as a child, I had no capacity to rectify these two cities. The one that lives in the myth, or the one that lives as the one that I see and experience in brick and mortar. You know, as a kid, I hadn't lived really long enough to be able to understand how places change over time. So this kind of story of how great it was just seemed like a story. So I think this experience had really primed me for having an interest to pay attention to how things go in and out of the collective consciousness, and how things live in stories and histories and myths, and their physical situations as sort of aligning or misaligning with these stories. You know, in the case of Detroit, the story of the place looked nothing like the place that I knew. And so I was very eager to, or very sort of lubricated to accept the idea that the story and the place are not the exact same thing. I was also really influenced by some teachers that I had along the way. And one of them, her name was Beatrice Colomina, who researched and theorized how culture and mass media and architecture relate to one another. One of her great recent project was a very deep dive into the role that Playboy magazine had in making modern architecture accessible to people. So this vessel for distributing architectural ideas came inside of a very unlikely but powerful package. And the magazine and Hugh Hefner were huge proponents of modern design. And the magazine featured interviews with people like Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe, and it also featured some of the design furniture of people like Errol Saarinen. And Colomina argues that this is really what helped make this kind of design accessible to the public, that this would, you know, instead of just seeing a building happening upon a building in space in a city or something like that, being given kind of first glance of it through a magazine that, you know, is probably delivering it unexpectedly, does a lot for distributing the message of architecture and building. And of course, Playboy has its roots in Chicago. What it's known as the Palm Olive Building now on the left was called the Playboy Building, and on the right was the original Playboy Mansion up on North Avenue. And famously, the architect, Mies van der Rohe's office was directly across the street from the Palm Olive Building. I don't know how strategic that was, but he had a straight view right into the windows of the primary offices of Playboy. But anyway, that's some of the background that led me to wanting to contribute to how popular culture media can live alongside buildings to help build a greater level of overall understanding and connection with the built environment. While I wasn't inspired to start a magazine, I had a bit of a different idea and experience. I was hot off of teaching my first online course, so I got the bright idea to start a YouTube channel. And trying like Victor Hugo, I looked to popular media platforms of today and landed on YouTube. After all, I had just gotten done committing 15 weeks of worth of lectures to digital video, and I was really excited to try and turn, some of the lessons that I've learned over the pandemic and the kind of new lifestyle that I've been living into a way of reaching potentially even greater audiences than I would have otherwise. And at the time, and still now, I hadn't really seen anyone that was consistently telling architectural design stories in the way that I thought I could. So I thought I'd just give it a go. It did not come easy. Starting and seeing yourself on camera is not a fun experience. And I was testing equipment and delivery for months. So I cut together a little bit of a blooper reel here that I thought I'd share of some of my false starts. Hello, welcome to a new channel where architectural professionals talk about buildings, what makes them good or bad, how buildings do what they do, and why those things are important. Hello. 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 Welcome to a new channel where Hello. Welcome to a new YouTube channel where architectural professionals talk about buildings. Welcome to a new YouTube channel where architectural professionals talk about buildings, what makes them good and what makes them not so good. Welcome to a new YouTube channel where Hello, and welcome to our brand new channel here on YouTube. Hello. Hello. Welcome to our brand new channel here on YouTube, where architects and some armchair architects break down why they think a building is good or bad, and ultimately try to get down to why it's important to talk about buildings at all. Yeah, it's hard, it's tough. So I thought to myself, maybe if I just had a little more confidence and maybe a new setting and maybe standing up would help the cause. Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Stewart Hicks and I'm a professor of architecture who wanted to make some videos about buildings. Yeah, so that didn't seem to do it either. But eventually I was able to get things going, and I've made videos on a whole range of topics so far, from seminars on famous architects to the role of geometry in architecture, to what kind of architect George Costanza would have been, to Lego blocks as gateways to the design of buildings and all sorts of things. And each video is featured on architecture news websites like ArchDaily, which is the most trafficked architecture website in the world, which helps keep the message out there pretty constantly. But more recently, I've been thinking back to that story of the Notre Dame Cathedral and how individual buildings might have a kind of companion piece of media and stories. So how could a YouTube video be used to preserve and intervene inside of the lives of buildings was a question that I asked myself. Because buildings and our experiences of them aren't as permanent as it seems. And video is actually a really great way to capture some of these fleeting moments. So one way to do this is a bit obvious, to make videos that are in danger of demolition. So to capture them on video and offer some thoughts about how people might appreciate the building in a different way. And so this video is just that. And so if you'll indulge me, I'd like to have you all take a bit of a watch. gearing up for a walk to the Loop of Chicago to check in on one of my favorite buildings. It's probably the most endangered building in the city. And I want to record some footage to have for myself and to present a little bit about what I think makes this building so special, and maybe sprinkle in some of my thoughts about its preservation. First, a few stops along the way. Chicago has some great architecture. Louis Sullivan, Daniel Burnham, Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe. These are the architects and structures that tend to represent architecture's robust architectural heritage to the world. That's only one story of Chicago architecture. There are a lot more than that, and many yet to be written. One thing those architects listed have in common is that they mostly build commercial buildings or private offices here in Chicago. Chicago isn't particularly well known for making great public architecture. That's not to say there isn't any great public architecture here. Just look at this dome by Louis Comfort Tiffany. When not shut down due to COVID, anyone can just waltz up, stand underneath, and take a photo of it. That's pretty great. The dome was set inside of a building that was originally designed as the Chicago Public Library, but is now called the Chicago Cultural Center, a place where various cultural programming and exhibitions take place, including the Chicago Architectural Biennial. But now the library is in this thing. What? While the dome in the Cultural Center is incredible, it's more like a beautiful piece of jewelry set within a building that is a little bit unremarkable. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't want it demolished. It's nice and all, but it should be preserved. It's fairly well made and it has some pretty nice materials, but I don't even know the name of the architect that designed it. And if I'm completely honest, I didn't even know this building existed until I've been here for about 5 years. If you walk west from the Cultural Center a few blocks, you'll come upon another public building. No, not that. Ooh, what is that? That's strange. Oh my God, that building is adorable. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. If you keep going west, you'll come upon another public building that has none of the traits of the Chicago Cultural Center. It's not particularly well made, and it certainly doesn't have any pretty materials. It does have something that people call a dome, but it's not really like any dome that I've ever seen. For one thing, it's flat. It's not as pretty as the Tiffany one. That's the problem with this building. It isn't pretty at all. It's awesome. What do I mean by awesome? I mean it to include every literal definition possible. Every entry into the dictionary of the word applies to this building. Extremely impressive or daunting, inspiring great admiration, apprehension, or fear. Breathtaking, amazing, stunning, astounding, magnificent, out of this world, amazeballs, badass, wondrous, awful. This is the Thompson Center. Today is looking like the building will be demolished. The state of Illinois is moving out. The alderman is getting the site rezoned. Brendan Riley, Alderman 42nd Ward, 312-744-3062. Call for more information. There are a lot of excuses for why the building should go, like the deferred maintenance. A number that's floating around is somewhere in the neighborhood or the ballpark of $350 million to fix the deferred maintenance. The building is also not very well loved by non-architects. Actual testimonial. Can there be an uglier building than the Thompson Center State of Illinois building? It's a waste of space, and the peachy color scheme on the outside makes me think of vomit. Is the Thompson Center good architecture? I think so, but not because of its crazy curved shape, its shimmering facade, or anything else that we might use to evaluate traditional buildings. I also have a soft spot for postmodern buildings, so all the fake columns, pastel colors, and other allusions to classical architecture makes me smirk and fall in love. Especially that dome, which isn't a dome. It's like a dome that was sliced right off. That's cool. Let's talk for a minute about cool. The Thompson Center is notoriously difficult to cool. It famously required a re-engineering of its HVAC system because the original one wasn't up for the task. Office folk brought in umbrellas to shield themselves from the sun and prevent overheating. The public saw the whole thing as a big blunder. That was compounded by how much over budget the building was, coupled with a few screwy politics of Chicago, and then there's the architect Helmut Jahn, who liked to wear a cape and look pretentious on the covers of magazines. All these things added up to a public perception that the building was an ego project to glorify its creators at taxpayer expense. But here's why the Thompson Center isn't a monumental ego project and why it's important. It's pretty freaking big. Believe it or not, big is an architectural term. Rem Koolhaas says so. At some point, big buildings no longer make sense to talk about or evaluate like other buildings because they aren't really a building anymore. They operate by a different set of rules. They're like cities or public infrastructure like a train system. By the way, the Thompson Center also has a multi-floor train station inside of it. That engineering problem with HVAC, that's a testament to just what a huge team effort this thing is. It's not about one person. It's a huge group of folks that take pride in this building that no single human can control of. Also, the building is so big that certain areas are just not architectural at all, just drop-ceiling, dry-walled boxes. No self-respecting, ego-driven architect would allow all of this unpredictability. Egomaniacs just don't work like that. This is the other way that the building is cool, the way that Marshall McLuhan means it, which is when media, well, you know what, while I think my ideas on Marshall McLuhan have a lot of validity, let's just hear what he has to say about it.
The way it's used in slang reverses the meaning of cool. Where the information or data level is low, the fill-in or participation is high.
The building is so open-ended, it invites people into it, both literally and to interpret what it all means. For instance, other big buildings aren't very forthcoming in showcasing their interior activities on the outside. This is due to the distance between the outside envelope and the interior. However, the Thompson Center deals with this in a very unique way. The center is completely cut out, just a huge hole in there. A huge, glorious, cylindrical hole. A hole for people. I think the interior of the atrium looks like the plaza at St. Peter's with open arms. Chicago doesn't have any real plazas. It has some outdoor spaces, but plazas are surrounded by buildings, and they're hard to come by, and this might be the best one in the city. Plazas are truly public spaces. They welcome everyone. They are sites to relax, to meet people, protest, celebrate. There's all different kinds of people that work inside of the building normally. People just passing through, people grabbing a coffee. These people wouldn't normally come together inside of a single building otherwise. They'd be dispersed throughout the city. And I think that's what makes this building cool. Not because it's a pretty facade or because I like the salmon colored glass, but because of how it brings people together.
Yeah, we're not allowed to film in here.
The building itself is so big that we pay extra attention to all the people inside. The people doing all the things people do in a city. The building is policy in action. It is the space of Chicago. It is its architecture, a reflection of Chicago. People see what they want to see in the Thompson Center. This building is for everyone, and it should be. It's the state government building in Chicago. Democracy is messy, and so is this building. That's because the building isn't really in Chicago. It is Chicago, and it coexists with it. Like literally. As a big building, it is like a microcosm of the city. So don't come visiting the Thompson Center expecting to see a building. If you do, you might want to vomit. It takes some training to decode the messages inside of the fragmented columns or how they relate to ancient architecture. Visit it instead expecting to see Chicago in all of its messy glory. And if you do plan to visit, you better come pretty quickly because it might be gone once you get here. I'll just, I stopped at the wrong spot. After shooting the video, the initial video, I had a kind of idea in thinking about the Notre Dame Cathedral project, and I wanted to encourage people to make stories about the Thompson Center and to consider and sort of dream up different ways that people might preserve the building. So I'm going to show that kind of the back end of this video, which tries to do just that. That, I think, is the problem with the Thompson Center. Not deferred maintenance. I mean, you could fix the building for the cost of making Avengers Endgame. It's not the bad restaurants and its food court. It was the fact that the architect trusted us to fill the building with stories, and we have yet to take the charge. The building is a question and a call to action, and we haven't picked it up. So here's my call. Let's write some stories about the Thompson Center. Even if these stories don't save the building, they can immortalize it in other ways. I mean, there has been some fun movies set inside of the building already. It's really good at playing a shopping mall. It's also the site for an awesome gunfight in the film Running Scared. I don't mean we need to have more movies set inside of the Thompson Center, although that's cool. What I mean is that we need stories where the building is a real character. And I'll tell you what, I'll share the 3D model where we made as part of our design studio at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I'll link it in the description and below. This was a team effort, so there's a list of students that created the model as well. With this model, you'll be able to create your own stories out of the 3D bones of the Thompson Center. Hopefully it helps and sparks your imagination. There's a saying by the designer Paul Rand that goes, if you can't make it good, make it big. And if you can't make it big, make it red. Well, the Thompson Center is pretty good, it's real big, and it's almost red. Most buildings don't even hit any of those. How many red buildings have you ever seen? We can also make it so that people read about this building and the stories that you create. The building can be read in ways that are beyond just the color of the interior. Even if we can't save the building, we can perhaps immortalize it in a way that glass and steel never could. Hey there, check out some of my other videos on architecture. Consider liking this one if you found it intriguing, and maybe subscribe to the channel if you're into thinking about the built environment with me every week. See ya. There you go. It's promoting me already. Of course, the video was made just before Helmut Jahn's unfortunate and sudden passing, which makes the conversation even more weighty as we consider the possibilities for this building. And at least one person has taken up the charge with this op-ed piece that was just published in the Chicago Tribune. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't, but it's in the form of a retrospective from the future of what the world is like after the Thompson Center was saved. It imagines a new public and private partnerships to make the building even more useful as a public space. And it's thankfully alive and well in the year 2035. Of course, this op-ed piece was written by a former student of mine, so you have to take the success of this endeavor with a grain of salt, because they were primed to like it already. Anyway, the thinking that was going on in the Thompson Center video, and this idea of preservation and a kind of use of popular media to allow architecture to live in the collective imagination, has spawned some slightly different ways of trying to approach the subject. And I've embarked on something I'm calling the Lost Architecture series, which is a whole series where I present either unbuilt or demolished buildings to the public on YouTube. So through a YouTube video, I can take people to places that they wouldn't otherwise be able to go. And each video starts with a 3D model of the building in the computer, like with the Thompson Center. I analyze the building and do a real-time walkthrough in a computer, like a video game. And I provide a link for others to be able to explore the building in their browser. So the ending part of the Thompson Center suggestion of how we might be able to get that building to kind of live even beyond maybe the bricks and mortar, or that case, the steel and glass, spawned this other series. And so I'd like to give you a very exclusive sneak peek into a video that is not out yet. It's coming out tomorrow. So you guys, this is a real privilege. And so the video might get a little changed. I think the intro music's a little aggressive. So let me know your thoughts if you have any opinions about it. Well, I'm going to show it to you guys now, which it takes a demolished building and tries to analyze it and think about it in a slightly new way. In this video, we're going to take a look at the first house built in the United States, made entirely from site-cast concrete and glass. It's a true masterpiece of brutalist architecture. It was built in the 1960s, but demolished in 1999, meaning that no one will ever be able to visit it again. So we're going to model the building digitally and explore it with a real-time walkthrough to discover what hidden discoveries are lurking inside. Stay tuned. Hello, my name is Stewart Hicks, and I teach architectural design studios and lecture courses at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Every once in a while, you come upon a building that just seems like it slipped through the cracks of history for whatever reason. Just looking at this house, I'm in awe that it ever existed. It made a splash when it was built, but then it was quickly forgotten and never found its place within the history books. Maybe you never want to live in this house, but I'm sure glad that it existed at some point. It's a bold experiment and novel construction techniques applied to a house and done in a way that has never been tried before. Not only that, the architects took complete advantage of the building techniques to create shapes that are only made possible by doing it in this way. And finally, it leads to supporting a completely unique and a thoughtful way for a family to live inside. It's called the Lincoln House, designed by Mary Otis Stevens and Thomas McNulty. And in this video, we're going to take a deep dive to learn a little bit more about it. We're going to model it in the computer, and then we'll walk through it using a program called Enscape. I've included a link in the description below where you can tour the house yourself without any special software. So let's discover more about this house together, beginning with the timeline. The Lincoln House was built in 1965 in Lincoln, Massachusetts, from which it derives its name. It was designed principally by Mary Otis Stevens in partnership with her husband, Thomas McNulty, for their family to live in. Mary Otis Stevens was born in 1928 in New York City. She studied philosophy at Smith College in 1949 and was active in the civil rights movement until entering architecture school at MIT or the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1953. While attending MIT, Mary stood out for both being one of the very few women studying architecture at the time and approaching the field from her activist and philosophy background. She crossed paths with a number of pioneering architects while at school, including Eero Saarinen, who was a visiting teacher there. He would, of course, go on to design the sweeping, curving concrete roof of the TWA terminal in New York. The director of the school at the time was Walter Gropius, a prominent figure of the Bauhaus who moved to America, bringing with him the sensibility of European modern architecture, and who built his own house in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which was born from his thoughts about modern homes and how families might live in unique ways. Also in the air at the time was an excitement for a set of investigations into the utility of concrete construction that would begin in the 1940s and find its name, Brutalism, from an essay written by Rainer Banham, who linked this work to Béton brut, meaning raw concrete in French. These folks found beauty in the unfinished nature of the utilitarian material and sought to showcase its possibilities. In addition to the material's texture, it can also create flowing curves that's much easier with this type of construction than others. But back to Mary Otis Stevens, who met her partner Thomas McNulty while studying at MIT, where he had just graduated and began teaching. After Mary graduated, the two got married and started practicing together until 1969, when they founded an architectural book publishing company called iPress, which existed until 1978, when the two divorced and ended up selling the house to a famous opera director named Sarah Caldwell. In addition to publishing books about movement and the city, they would do a few important projects together, including the Wolf Trap National Park for the Performing Arts. However, the Lincoln House remained their most notable work and was demolished in 1999 to make way for a much more ordinary house with much more money. The Lincoln House was designed by the architects for their own family to live in, and thus it embodies a level of experimentation and personal views in architecture that wouldn't really be possible otherwise. It was perhaps the first house built in the United States of entirely concrete and glass. It was built along a north-south axis and located on Weston Road, near Beaver Pond, surrounded by bushes and trees. The architects were interested in three things in this design. One, showcasing the possibilities of rigorous use of concrete construction. Two, ideas about movement, flow, hesitation, and stasis. And three, reimagining how a family might live together. While this isn't the order of importance for the architects, I'll talk about each one of these in this order. The house uses a high lime, cast-in-place concrete that creates a lot of color variation that the architects really appreciated. The concrete was poured into the tops of forms that were lined with 2-inch by 12-inch Douglas fir planks. To save on cost and materials, these boards were reused between the castings, and this 12-inch module would supply the size of the segmentation for the curvature of the walls. But some of the walls had a curve which was too tight to make, so they cut the boards down to make the segment smaller, and they had to do these ones last because they couldn't reuse those boards anymore after they'd been cut. All of the curves of the house, coupled with the roughness of the concrete, made it feel both like a sculpture and like a piece of geology or landscape. And in order to heighten this effect, there were no doors in the house. All of the enclosures and openness was achieved with curves, walls, and space. In Mary Stevens' words, the curves were throwing you out rather than holding you in. Each projected its energy into nature. We use the invisible power of the concave wall to relate the building beyond its site to the woods and the fields of rural Lincoln. She also said that we wanted to make the house like a miniature city. It was very urban. The idea was to bring people together, not isolate them in boxes on different floors. You had choices all of the time. Fostered movement not only between the different areas of the interior, but also between the inside and the outside. Although there was one regular front door made of steel and glass, there were actually 6 other points where one could gain access to the outside on the ground floor. And these were sliding glass doors between undulating walls. The intention was that they really didn't have to read as doors, just as openings. most of the building is quite open at the heart, where we have the entry and circulation, the living, and the library. The library sort of protects the dining. And then at the ends, we have the kitchen and the staff areas. And on the other end, the children's zone. And most of these are really open, but then some exceptions are the bathrooms and one bedroom off the kitchen, which they call a guest room, but I suspect it's a staff room. But even the bedroom's walls don't really connect to the ceiling, so the bedroom could join the flow of the rest of the house. And Mary Otis Stevens says that you needed to keep moving in order to take it all in. The inherent movement of the curvilinear geometry kept pushing you dynamically through the space, rather than confining you to one vantage point. She goes on to say that there were different ways of going back and forth, as in a city. This allowed the children to bypass the living room, and the grown-ups if they wanted to, although they were seen. You didn't have to engage with people directly. You could if you wanted to, and in moving through a space, you could look for options. You might want to be in an introverted piazza. You might want to be the introverted streets or the side streets. But the important thing is that you have the chance to choose. Building the Lincoln House in 3D was a challenge. First off, there were few straight lines. There are a number of different radiuses of curvature, with tangent lines springing from them at all sorts of angles. Walls aren't a single thickness either. They vary in thickness depending on the degree of curvature. There is also no underlying grid that we could find that would help to align some of the walls. And although the house is mostly on a single floor, it's not very flat. The floor is constantly ramping or stepping up or down. And the ceiling also steps up and down, creating very dynamic spaces, but also creating difficult to understand relationships between the elements. However, the house was well documented. Even the famous Julius Schulman photographed the house, so we have a lot of reference material to work from in order to ensure that we got it right. So let's see what it's like to explore the Lincoln House. The entrance to the house feels like an alien reaching out for us, and as soon as we enter, we're pulled into and through the house with the curved walls. The space sucks you in, where we're presented with fragments of architecture coming together. We're never presented with the entirety of a shape, or an element like stairs or even a room. We're only given a glimpse and then encouraged to see where it leads. The central stair is like the spine in the alien, allows us to orient ourselves. It can be pretty easy to not know where you are. The curves are all kind of blend together. However, we are given a concert of long views and short ones. Some views that look across or through many spaces, and others that just terminate at a wall. Skylights help illuminate spaces and drag light down onto the textured concrete walls. No single space feels like a real destination. Everything is in between. We're on our way to somewhere else. That remains true until we get to the library, which is more of a closed circle. But even here, there are very distinct ways out, both to the sides and up to the second floor and out through the skylight. There are connections and variety everywhere we turn. We're always presented with choices of where to look or where to go. Going upstairs feels like we're slipping between realms, up and down and side to side. And finally, at the top of the stair, we arrive at their office where we can look outside over the landscape or watch how the light caresses the curved wall below the skylight that funnels down to the library. Oops. Sorry, technical glitch. I think we'll stop it there. I just wanted to thank everyone for listening in and tuning in, and just kind of leave you with, maybe a suggestion to sort of look closely at your built environment. And if there's something that maybe seems a little unique or strange or something that you don't know why it is, maybe investigate maybe what the story is behind it. And if you find that story, email me and maybe I can make a video about it. I'd be happy to take any questions or listen to any thoughts that anybody has.
Well, thank you, Professor Hicks. This was just fascinating. I actually, as as you're presenting and we're listening to this, you remind me of, and I hope this is a positive comparison, but like Rick Steves or somebody that's going out and exploring the world and just exploring through those eyes of architecture is just amazing. So thank you for sharing all this with us. I think we have a few questions coming in, but we had a couple that came in before. So I'd like to start with one of those. And again, I'm the messenger. So have you ever, right, well, I just want you to think I planted this. Have you ever considered doing a video about UIC's campus? And is there a story there you'd like to tell?
Yes, of course. So actually, 2 weeks ago, I was did a video tour of the campus to a group called Docomomo, which is an international architectural appreciation society. And I did that with a former art historian, he's currently still an art historian, but former UIC professor, Bob Bergman. And we did this tour together of the campus, and it was a lot of fun. But I was thinking as a video was to build a 3D model of the old walkways and do a walkthrough of that, and then giving people the 3D file to be able to explore that stuff on their own. So if you guys, like, just to be clear too, I know I said it, but with each one of these, there's a link in the description of the YouTube video where you click on it and it will take you to, in your browser window, the 3D model that you can explore on your own. So the idea is that, you know, the video itself maybe primes you to like think about in certain ways, but then, you know, encourage people to inform their own opinion. And I think that'd be great for the walkway. Like, I think, you know, I could give my own thoughts about it, and, you know, what a loss I think it is, but also with understanding for why, you know, probably had to come down. But then also just let people kind of form their own opinions about it. But yes, definitely. I was also thinking of a video that would just be about why architects love brutalist architecture and why most people probably don't. And I think I could use UIC as a great sort of thing to explain those ideas around.
I think people would love to hear that, why architects like brutalism. And also the walkways, we hear lots of alumni comments about how people miss them or they hated them because they leaked on their heads. I also would imagine you're going to get some requests for BSB, the Behavioral Sciences Building, and to try and explain that, because that's another popular one that we are about.
I can only do my best to explain it. I can't, you know, I have limited abilities.
We had another question that was going back to the Thompson Center.
Yeah.
And somebody had said, so now what? I thought it was going to be demolished. So can you talk a little about what is going to happen, or we think is going to happen with the Thompson Center?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much a foregone conclusion. It is up for sale. You know, I guess it would be possible. And I think there's someone in the audience who said they're on some board or some official sounding group that maybe has a lot to say about this. But my understanding is that it's up for sale. Staff of Preservation Chicago. So Mary Lou Seidel, yeah. So she's probably the person to ask. My understanding is that it's up for sale, and what people do with it post-sale might include preservation, or it might not, you know. So I think that would be my understanding of its current situation. But I mean, just to be clear too, like, I think in a way, I think the making of the video or encouraging people to make their own stories about the project is a sort of act of preservation in and of itself, right? Like that it's a way of injecting the building into the culture in a certain way, even if the building no longer exists, that maybe it could exist in other ways, in stories and things like that. So yeah, I hope that message resonates, but I would also like to see the building stick around, because I think it's I mean, I know like the UIC campus or the Thompson Center are really hard to like, but just as an architect, they're just such bold experiments that are amazing to encourage, and that people took a chance on at one point. And when you experiment at that scale, there's bound to be issues, you know. When you design an entire campus for a university that goes up in a few years, there's bound to be a lot of issues. And, you know, it's part of the process is to take care of it and to think about that it's going to have lives along the way that probably aren't part of the original architect's vision. And that's okay, you know, but I think that that we want to ultimately encourage the kind of bold experiments that these kind of buildings and campuses represent.
Well, and I think there's some really neat parts about the architecture that's not very well known in many of the buildings. As I know, you know that the windows are designed as block eyes for the University of Illinois. And unless somebody points that out, people are like, why do you have such skinny windows? Is it like a prison? So trying to sort of showcase the meaning behind, or the thought behind it, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a great point relative to the sort of thesis that I'm putting out there, that like the companion of the stories about why it is the way it is aren't always fully communicated in the architecture itself, and it's on companion media to be able to tell some of those.
So I think this is a good next question. Somebody had asked, what is one thing that you wish most people understood about architecture?
Oh boy.
Is there one thing?
One thing to understand about architecture, sum up my entire being in one in one thing.
Maybe the top things that you wish that the average person really understood about architecture or had a different appreciation for.
Yeah. I lived in a really crazy house when I lived in Urbana, Illinois. It had 20-foot ceilings, I think, in a pyramid. It leaked all over the place. It was a modern building from the 70s. And I got used to that feeling like home. So I can't live in a space anymore that has 8-foot ceilings. Like, it feels oppressive to me. So like I legitimately absorbed this other kind of building as an environment that has meaning and is place for me. Like, I'm not making that up. I'm not just advocating for architecture. Like, it feels like home. I want to encourage people to give buildings a chance with that. And like with UIC, it's hard to like sometimes. Like, I get that. I get it. But it's also pretty amazing. You know, it's really unique. It's really incredible. And it's not everywhere. And I think an appreciation for uniqueness as a quality, even if it's kind of hard to live with sometimes, that the uniqueness is worth fighting for sometimes. Maybe you'll start to feel like home in there someday. I'm sure there's probably people in the audience who've been at UIC for 20 years and still hate every corner of it. But I think my experience of living in a really, really strange house and really absorbing it and feeling like home, I hope people could give a similar chance to things that maybe look like a pretty unique situation, but that could become people's new reality in a positive way.
Yeah, and I find when people have a certain image about UIC and haven't been on campus for many years, and then when they come back, just how that has changed, even with the trees, and just sort of how the landscape has even changed and some of the newer buildings.
Right.
How it
so the campus was meant to have a whole landscape architecture complement to it that really didn't happen much, and so the architect kind of was, you know, I give the analogy that like, everything's a nail to a hammer, and UIC is a bit of example of like everything is building to an architect, you know. So like all of Walter Netsch's solutions were building solutions, you know. Like, you need walkways, okay, let's build something for it. But you know, maybe that's not always the best way, but you don't throw the baby with the bathwater, you know. Like, I think the trees and, you know, new walkways and like the Adirondack chairs and things that kind of soften it are welcome, I think, additions that I think really really allow the thing to live in today's world, even if it's not exactly the vision of the architect.
Yeah, exactly. We had another question come in about, what is your opinion around preserving buildings, knowing that iconic buildings like the Thompson Center are in spaces that were occupied by other buildings? How do you choose what's worth saving?
Yeah, I don't think I'm a preservationist, to be honest. Like, I have a lot of appreciation for buildings. I find it sad that like the Prentice Hospital was demolished. I think that was an amazing piece of architecture, but I'm also not really one to tell other people what to do with their stuff. Like, and so there is a real challenge to find that line, you know, like how much authority should like, should there be exerted on someone who owns a piece of architecture to kind of preserve that architecture, I think is a really important question to ask. I am not the person to kind of draw that line. Instead, I kind of look to other media to kind of supplement that stuff and to allow people to, I think part of what I see my job is to increase the appreciation for these things and hope that people will choose to preserve it. But I'm not out there saying like, you have to preserve it. Like I'm not that person, but I do think it's very important. So I guess maybe I have a slightly different approach, or maybe I just have one approach amongst a suite of approaches that you know, lots of different people would take. But you know, I do deal with facilities at UIC, and I know how hard it is, and how much money and time and effort it takes to update buildings that are now 50 years old, buildings especially that were designed to not need much maintenance, which means that when it like goes completely, you know, and you know, I get that, and I know it's complicated, but I still hope it gets preserved, and I hope, you know, I hope those things, but I hope I'm not overly dogmatic about it. Like I realize it's a complicated situation. I want to do my part, but I don't want to shame people into, like, I don't know. I think it's a very complicated subject, and I'm one person, and I do my best.
Feels like that could be a whole course. I'm just
that's a whole major, I mean, that's a whole genre of work that I'm very much an outsider of.
Maybe one last question. And I don't know if you know the answer to this, because I'm not trying to put you on the spot about UIC's origins, but do you know if the design of UIC was a result of the protests in the 1960s, deferring to the sit-ins and why we have small windows? And
No, not at all. It was designed and built before the protests. So, you know, there's a lot of, I think, misinformation about that, like, especially with like UH, and the fact that, you know, administrators are kind of at the top. That was pre the unrest that was happening at the time. You know, of course, the campus was kind of inserted into another neighborhood. So there is, I think, a contentious relationship anytime that, you know, that kind of thing happens. But as far as the global and national unrest that was associated with the late 60s, the design and much of the campus had already been constructed at that point.
Thank you. Well, we would certainly advocate if you wanted to do one on the brutalism and the design of UIC, just from a historical purpose, because we get lots of questions about this throughout the years and depending on somebody graduated. So sure. Thank you so much, Professor Hicks. This has been so engaging and informative and just a really fun presentation, and really appreciate all of your time today. Just real quickly to close this out, please join us for our next Alumni Exchange program on Tuesday, June 15th at noon Central Standard Time, when we will be joined by UIC alumna Patty Ballesteros, who is a first-generation college student and serves on the Alumni Career Services Committee for the UIC Alumni Board. Patty will offer advice and share strategies about building a successful and satisfying career as she presents tried and tested strategies for career success. To find a recording of this episode and all of our episodes, please go to go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, please be on the lookout for that quick survey I mentioned at the beginning. Again, thank you so much, Professor Hicks, for all of your time sharing this knowledge. We put your link in there to, if people want to check out the YouTube series, and we encourage folks to go ahead and do that and subscribe. Thank you for all the incredible work that you're doing on faculty at UIC. We're so proud that you're part of our faculty. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again at another Alumni Exchange program. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.